in South Carolina's tidal lowcountry, where ancient waters hold their secrets. Some mysteries run deeper than any net can reach. At 2:47 a.m. on September 23, 2023, the United States Coast Guard Station Charleston received an automated distress signal from a commercial fishing vessel operating in the Basin estuary system of South Carolina's lowcountry. The signal originated from the Miss Loretta, a 38-foot shrimp trawler registered to Jerome Washington of Colleton County. What made the signal unusual wasn't its timing. Night trawling was common practice during optimal tide conditions, but rather what Coast Guard Petty Officer Marcus Rivera discovered when he reached the vessel's reported coordinates. The Miss Loretta was drifting unmanned through the dark waters of the Combahee River's tidal creek system, her diesel engine still running at idle, navigation lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Rivera boarded the vessel at approximately 3:20 a.m. The wheelhouse showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. Jerome Washington's coffee cup sat half full on the instrument panel, still warm to the touch. His reading glasses rested folded beside a nautical chart of the local waterways, marked with his characteristic blue ink notations of tide times and optimal trawling locations. His personal logbook lay open to that evening's entry, the final line reading simply, "Net's down 230 hours. Good shrimp sign?" But Jerome Washington was nowhere to be found. The Coast Guard's initial inspection revealed the Miss Loretta's primary systems functioning normally. The radio worked perfectly, the GPS showed accurate positioning data, and the engine displayed no mechanical issues. The vessel's emergency life ring remained secured in its mount. Jerome's personal flotation device hung undisturbed on its hook beside the captain's chair. It was the condition of the shrimp nets that provided the first clue something had gone seriously wrong. When Rivera activated the hydraulic winch to retrieve the trawling nets, what came up from the dark water below bore little resemblance to standard fishing equipment. The heavy nylon mesh had been twisted and torn, sections ripped completely away, as if the nets had encountered something substantial beneath the surface. Steel cables showed stress marks and fraying consistent with extreme tension. "I've been working these waters for 15 years, Rivera would later tell investigators. "I've seen nets damaged by debris, caught on wrecks, even tangled with dolphins. This was different." The pattern of damage suggested the nets hit something large and unyielding, something that didn't give way. The Miss Loretta's fish hold contained approximately 40 pounds of brown shrimp, typical for the early stages of a night trawl. Jerome's tackle box remained organized and complete. His thermos of coffee, prepared by his wife Dorothy that evening, was nearly full. Every indication pointed to a routine fishing operation interrupted suddenly and without warning. As dawn broke over the salt marshes of the Basin, painting the Spartina grass in shades of gold and green, the Coast Guard began a systematic search of the surrounding waters. The tidal creek system in this area extends for miles, a complex network of channels that wind between barrier islands and through ancient rice plantation grounds. The murky water, stained brown by tannins from centuries of marsh grass decay, limited visibility to mere feet below the surface. By 6:00 a.m., additional vessels from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources Marine Patrol had joined the search. The Miss Loretta was towed to the state dock at Bennett's Point, where investigators could examine the vessel more thoroughly. But even in daylight, with proper equipment and experienced personnel, the boat yielded few additional clues about its captain's fate. Jerome Washington, a third-generation commercial fisherman who knew these waters better than most knew their own neighborhoods, had simply vanished from his vessel during what appeared to be a routine night of shrimp trawling. The mystery deepened when investigators realized that in 40 years of fishing these same waters, Jerome had never once called for assistance, never filed an insurance claim for equipment damage, and never failed to return home by dawn. Something had happened in those dark waters of the Combahee River system. Something that had torn apart heavy commercial fishing nets and made an experienced sea captain disappear without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Jerome Washington began working the waters of the Basin estuary before he could properly tie his own shoes. Born in 1963 on St. Helena Island, he was the third generation of Washingtons to make their living from the abundant shrimp, crab, and oyster beds that flourished in South Carolina's coastal lowcountry. His grandfather, Samuel Washington, had purchased the family's first commercial fishing license in 1948, shortly after returning from service in World War II. His father, Moses Washington, expanded the operation in the 1970s, acquiring the Miss Loretta in 1981, the same vessel from which Jerome would disappear 42 years later. By September 2023, Jerome had accumulated over 4 decades of experience navigating the complex tidal systems that define the Basin. Named for the Ashpoo, Combahee, and Edisto rivers that flow through it, this pristine estuary encompasses more than 350,000 acres of salt marsh, tidal creeks, and barrier islands. It represents one of the largest undeveloped coastal ecosystems on the eastern seaboard, a maze of waterways that can challenge even experienced mariners. But Jerome Washington was far from inexperienced. Local fishing guides often consulted him about tide patterns and seasonal shrimp movements. His handwritten logs, meticulously maintained for decades, contained detailed records of water temperatures, salinity levels, and catch rates that read like a scientific study of the estuary's ecosystem. Dorothy Washington, his wife of 36 years, later told investigators that Jerome could predict tide times without consulting charts, could sense weather changes hours before they appeared on radar, and could navigate the unmarked channels of the Combahee River system in complete darkness. That man knew every oyster bed, every channel marker, every sandbar between here and Charleston, Dorothy said during her interview with Marine Patrol officers. He could tell you which creeks would be productive on any given tide, which areas to avoid during spawning season, where the currents ran strongest. The water was his office, his church, and his playground all rolled into one. Jerome's expertise had been hard-earned through decades of working in conditions that would intimidate many mariners. The Basin's tidal range exceeds 8 feet during spring tides, creating powerful currents that can push small vessels off course, or trap them in shallow areas when the tide retreats. The water itself ranges from gin clear near the ocean inlets to coffee dark in the upper reaches of the river systems, where centuries of tannin-rich runoff from cypress swamps creates visibility conditions that can drop to 0 during high tide. In recent months, however, Jerome had begun expressing concerns about changes in the estuary that he couldn't fully explain. According to his fishing partner, Tommy Simmons, Jerome had noticed subtle shifts in shrimp behavior and migration patterns. Catches that should have been productive based on 40 years of experience were yielding disappointing results. Areas that had reliably produced brown shrimp for generations seemed to be experiencing population declines. Jerome was worried about something, Simmons told investigators. He kept talking about how the water felt different, how the currents weren't running the way they should. I thought maybe he was just getting older, you know? But Jerome, he felt things in the water that other people couldn't sense. If he said something was wrong, something was probably wrong. Jerome's concerns weren't entirely unique among local fishermen. Several captains had reported equipment problems in recent months. GPS units providing inaccurate readings in certain areas, depth finders showing anomalous bottom conditions, and nets returning damaged from areas where no known obstacles existed. But Jerome's reports were more specific and more persistent than others. His personal logbook from the weeks leading up to his disappearance contained increasingly detailed notes about what he termed wrong tides. Entries described water movements that didn't match predicted tide tables, temperature variations that seemed inconsistent with seasonal norms, and areas where his fish finder detected unusual bottom signatures. One entry from September 10th read, "Creek running backward during flood tide. Nets fouled on unknown obstruction. GPS off by 200 yards near old rice field markers." The Miss Loretta itself had been Jerome's second home for more than 4 decades. He knew every vibration of her diesel engine, every characteristic of her handling in different sea conditions. The 38-foot vessel, built in 1979 by a local shipyard, had been meticulously maintained throughout Jerome's ownership. Recent inspection records showed all safety equipment current and in proper working order. The Coast Guard's post-incident examination found no mechanical deficiencies that might have contributed to an accident. What made Jerome's disappearance particularly puzzling to those who knew him was his unwavering routine and cautious nature. He typically began night trawling operations around midnight, working the optimal tide windows when shrimp move most actively through the creek systems. He maintained radio contact with other vessels in the area, filed float plans with his wife, and carried multiple forms of emergency communication equipment. Jerome Washington was not the type of fisherman who took unnecessary risks or ventured into unfamiliar waters. After 40 years of working the same estuary system, there should have been no surprises waiting for him in the dark waters of the Combahee River. Yet something had surprised him on September 23, 2023. Something had gone wrong in waters he knew better than anyone alive. 3 days after Jerome Washington's disappearance, investigators found themselves sitting in the modest living room of Sarah Goodwine, an 84-year-old Gullah elder whose family had lived on St. Helena Island for more than 2 centuries. Miss Sarah, as she was known throughout the community, possessed a deep understanding of the Basin's waters that extended far beyond tide charts and fishing regulations. The water had been talking for months now, Miss Sarah told Marine Patrol Officer Lisa Chen during their interview on September 26th. Talking in ways it ain't supposed to talk. Old folks knowing something ain't right with the water. Jerome, he been listening too. That's why what happened to him don't surprise me none. The Gullah Geechee culture of South Carolina's Sea Islands represents one of the most intact African American cultural traditions in the United States. Descendants of enslaved Africans who worked the coastal rice plantations, the Gullah people developed unique relationships with the lowcountry's marine environment over generations of fishing, crabbing, and oyster harvesting. Their traditional ecological knowledge, passed down through oral tradition, often encompasses observations that formal science takes years to document. Miss Sarah's concerns centered on what she described as disturbed water in several areas of the Basin. For the past 6 months, she explained, local residents had been reporting unusual phosphorescence in the tidal creeks, glowing patches of water that appeared during nighttime hours, particularly during new moon phases when natural bioluminescence should have been minimal. Ain't the regular shining water that comes sometimes, she clarified, referring to the naturally occurring bioluminescent plankton that occasionally illuminated disturbed water in the estuary. This different. This water shine like it got electricity in it. Shine in places where nothing should be moving to make it shine. And it show up regular like same places, same times. Several local fishermen had documented these phosphorescent displays with cell phone cameras and videos. The images showed distinct patches of greenish-blue light beneath the water's surface, appearing in areas where depth charts indicated relatively deep channels. The luminescence seemed to pulse in regular patterns, unlike the random sparkle typically associated with disturbed bioluminescent organisms. Traditional Gullah fishing practices include numerous taboos and seasonal restrictions based on centuries of observation. Many of these traditions align closely with modern conservation principles, protecting spawning areas during critical reproductive periods and avoiding waters during specific environmental conditions. But some of the taboos address phenomena that contemporary marine science doesn't fully recognize. According to Miss Sarah, traditional knowledge warned against fishing during certain combinations of tide, moon phase, and seasonal conditions. When the water get confused, when it don't know which way to flow, that's when the old spirits get active, she explained. Smart fisherman, he wait for the water to settle before he put his nets down. This traditional concept of confused water appeared to align with recent reports from local captains. In the months preceding Jerome's disappearance, several fishermen had reported encounters with unusual current patterns in areas where water flow should have been predictable. Tommy Simmons, Jerome's frequent fishing partner, described conditions where his GPS indicated he should be experiencing flood tide, while visual evidence suggested ebb tide conditions. It's like the water couldn't make up its mind which direction to flow, Simmons told investigators. You'd have current running one way near the surface, different way down deep. makes it real hard to keep your nets positioned properly. Did ya? The equipment problems reported by local fishermen had also intensified in recent months. Captain Robert Brown, who operated a charter fishing service in the area, documented repeated instances of electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific locations. His fish finder would show depths of 40 feet in areas where charts indicated 15 feet of water. His GPS would indicate positions that placed his vessel hundreds of yards from his actual location. Started happening back in March or April, Brown explained. Always in the same general area. Always during certain tide conditions. I began marking those spots on my charts, telling customers we'd fish elsewhere until whatever was causing the problems got sorted out. The Gullah community's response to these disturbances followed traditional patterns. Elder fishermen began avoiding certain areas during specific conditions, relying on generations of accumulated knowledge about when and where to fish safely. Younger community members, many of whom had moved away from traditional practices, sometimes dismissed these precautions as superstition. Jerome Washington, despite his scientific approach to fishing, had maintained strong connections to traditional Gullah knowledge through his grandmother, who had taught him to read natural signs that didn't appear on any chart. According to Miss Sarah, Jerome had visited her in early September to discuss his observations about the changing water conditions. "He come by here about 3 weeks before he went missing," she recalled. "Told me the water been acting strange. Told me his net's been getting torn up in places where nothing should be down there to tear them. I told him what my grandmother told me. When the water get angry, best thing to do is leave it alone until it calm down." Yes, sir. But commercial fishing schedules don't always accommodate traditional wisdom. Jerome had boat payments, equipment maintenance costs, and seasonal pressures that required him to work during optimal conditions regardless of traditional taboos. The night of September 23rd represented ideal conditions for shrimp trawling. Proper tide timing, favorable weather, and peak seasonal activity. It was also, according to Miss Sarah's calculations, exactly the type of conditions when traditional knowledge suggested the water would be most confused and potentially dangerous. Jerome knew better, she said quietly. But knowing better and being able to do better, sometimes that's two different things. The water took him because he couldn't wait for it to settle down. On September 25th, 2023, Marine Patrol Officer Lisa Chen arrived at the Bennett's Point dock to coordinate what should have been a straightforward missing person investigation. Instead, she found herself navigating a complex web of jurisdictional boundaries that complicated every aspect of the search for Jerome Washington. The Basin estuary system crosses multiple jurisdictional lines, creating a bureaucratic maze that can slow investigations to a crawl. State waters managed by the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources overlap with federal waters under Coast Guard jurisdiction. Portions of the estuary fall within the boundaries of the Basin National Wildlife Refuge, adding federal Fish and Wildlife Service oversight. Several areas encompass traditional tribal fishing grounds where the Edisto Indian tribe maintains certain rights and responsibilities. We had 5 different agencies that needed to be consulted before we could deploy any significant search resources, Chen explained in her official report. Each agency had different protocols, different equipment capabilities, and different ideas about how the investigation should proceed. Chen, a 10-year veteran of marine law enforcement, had never encountered a case quite like Jerome's disappearance. The physical evidence was minimal but puzzling. The damaged fishing net suggested some type of underwater collision or entanglement, but sonar surveys of the area where Jerome was last known to be fishing revealed no obvious obstacles. The Coast Guard's initial search had covered a 6-square-mile area around the Miss Loretta's discovered position, using both surface vessels and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment. The search effort faced immediate logistical challenges. The murky water of the Basin limited underwater visibility to less than 3 feet in most areas. Strong tidal currents meant that any evidence or remains could have been carried miles from the original incident location within hours. The vast network of tidal creeks and marsh channels provided countless areas where a person could become trapped or hidden. We're dealing with an area roughly the size of Los Angeles, Chen noted, but instead of city blocks, we have thousands of acres of salt marsh, tidal creeks, and open water. If someone goes missing out there, finding them requires a combination of science, experience, and honestly, a fair amount of luck. No. The limited resources available for the search reflected the rural nature of Colleton County and the specialized equipment required for marine operations. The county sheriff's office owned 2 patrol boats, but neither was equipped for extended offshore operations or underwater search capabilities. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources could provide additional patrol vessels and experienced marine officers. Their diving team was based in Charleston and had limited availability. Chen's review of Coast Guard records revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 15 years, the Ace Basin area had experienced 7 unexplained disappearances of experienced fishermen and mariners. Most cases involved single operators working alone during nighttime hours. In each instance, vessels were found drifting unmanned with no obvious signs of struggle or mechanical failure. These weren't novice boaters or weekend warriors, Chen observed. These were people who knew the water, who had been fishing these areas for decades. The fact that experienced mariners kept disappearing under similar circumstances suggested we were dealing with something more than random accidents. The cold case files painted a troubling picture. In 2019, Captain Eddie Mitchell vanished from his crab boat in similar circumstances. Vessel found drifting. No distress call. No obvious cause for the disappearance. In 2016, recreational fisherman David Parks disappeared while night fishing alone. His boat was discovered the following morning with his tackle still deployed, but no sign of Parks himself. Each case had been investigated thoroughly within the constraints of available resources, but none had been resolved. What made the pattern more concerning was the consistency of conditions under which the disappearances occurred. Each incident involved lone operators working during optimal fishing conditions, times when experienced local fishermen would be expected to be most active and confident in their abilities. Weather conditions were favorable in each case. Mechanical failures had been ruled out through post-incident inspections. Chen began coordinating with federal authorities to expand the scope of the investigation. The FBI's specialized dive team could provide underwater search capabilities that local resources lacked, but federal involvement required justification beyond a simple missing person case. The pattern of similar incidents provided that justification. When you have multiple experienced mariners disappearing under nearly identical circumstances in the same general area, you have to consider the possibility of an environmental hazard that hasn't been identified or properly documented, Chen explained to federal investigators. The environmental angle opened additional investigative possibilities. The Army Corps of Engineers maintained detailed records of underwater obstacles, wrecks, and hazards in navigable waters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tracked water quality conditions and unusual oceanographic phenomena. The Environmental Protection Agency monitored industrial discharge and contamination issues. But accessing and coordinating information from multiple federal agencies proved time-consuming. Each agency operated under different protocols and priorities. What seemed urgently important to local Marine Patrol officers might not trigger immediate response from federal bureaucracies dealing with nationwide responsibilities. We were dealing with a situation where time was critical, but the system was designed for deliberate, methodical processes, Chen noted. Jerome Washington needed immediate, intensive search efforts. But getting those resources required working through channels that measured response times in weeks rather than hours. As September faded into October, the intensive search phase began winding down. Coast Guard protocols typically scaled back active searches after 2 weeks unless new evidence emerged to justify continued resource allocation. Local volunteer efforts continued, but without professional dive teams and specialized equipment, the likelihood of finding answers diminished significantly. The investigation remained officially active, but practically speaking, Jerome Washington had joined a growing list of experienced mariners who had simply vanished from waters they knew better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. By October 2nd, Marine Patrol Officer Lisa Chen had authorized a specialized dive team from Charleston to examine the creek bottom, where Jerome Washington's vessel had been found drifting. The murky waters of the Ace Basin presented unique challenges. Visibility rarely exceeded 3 feet, and the shifting tides could trap divers in narrow channels between oyster beds. Lead diver Marcus Thompson descended first, following a weighted line to the channel floor 30 feet below. What he found contradicted everything investigators expected. Instead of the typical soft mud bottom common to South Carolina tidal creeks, Thompson encountered scarred sediment, long gouges and depressions that suggested something large had repeatedly scraped across the creek bed. The bottom looked like a construction site, Thompson later reported to Officer Chen. Deep furrows running parallel to the current, some of them 6 feet wide. And debris, pieces of metal, concrete blocks, things that had no business being in a natural waterway. Marine biologist Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived 3 days later to assess the environmental impact. What she discovered disturbed her more than the physical damage. The ecosystem in affected areas showed signs of severe disruption. Oyster beds that had thrived for generations were bleached and dying. Fish populations had abandoned traditional feeding grounds. Even the Spartina grass along the creek banks showed stress patterns consistent with chemical contamination. In 30 years of studying these waters, Dr. Hendricks documented in her preliminary report, "I've never seen this level of ecological disturbance without an obvious cause. No oil spills, no industrial discharge, no construction activity." The historical research proved equally puzzling. County records dating back to 1923 contained references to similar incidents. Commercial fishermen reported equipment damage, boats found drifting unmanned, and unexplained changes in traditional fishing grounds. A 1967 Coast Guard report described the recovery of a crab boat in nearly identical circumstances. Vessel intact, captain missing, nets damaged beyond repair. Most intriguing were the sonar readings collected by the dive team. The creek's deepest sections, channels that local fishermen had navigated for decades, showed anomalous return signatures. Hard, angular objects rested on the bottom where natural sediment should have accumulated. When divers attempted to investigate these readings directly, they encountered strong cross-currents that made close examination dangerous. "The sonar doesn't lie," explained Thompson during his debriefing. "There's something down there, multiple somethings, that don't belong in a tidal creek. Metal structures, definitely man-made, but positioned in ways that make no engineering sense." No. Officer Chen requested underwater metal detection equipment, but her department's budget limitations delayed the survey. By the time specialized equipment arrived in early October, Hurricane Dorian's approach forced suspension of all diving operations. When conditions finally improved, the storm surge had shifted sediment throughout the channel system, potentially burying whatever evidence lay beneath. The investigation took another turn when Chen discovered that similar sonar anomalies had been recorded in other South Carolina waterways, the Combahee River, the Ashpoo Creek, and sections of the Edisto River. Each location had a history of unexplained maritime incidents spanning multiple decades. Dr. Hendricks' final environmental assessment raised more questions than it answered. Water samples from affected areas contained trace elements not naturally occurring in coastal ecosystems, metallic compounds that suggested industrial contamination, but from no identifiable source. The chemical signature matched no known pollutant in the EPA databases. "We're looking at contamination patterns that don't fit any industrial model I know, Doctor," Hendricks explained to Chen during their final consultation. "The metallic traces are consistent with electrical discharge or high-voltage activity. But there's no power infrastructure in these areas that could account for such contamination." The dive team's final survey before winter weather suspended operations yielded one more piece of the puzzle. Thompson discovered sections of heavy cable embedded in the creek bottom, not the typical underwater utility lines that supplied power to barrier islands, but something different. The cable showed signs of recent damage, with exposed conductors and melted insulation that suggested electrical failure under extreme conditions. "These weren't standard power cables," Thompson reported. "They were heavier gauge, designed for higher voltage loads, but they weren't connected to any infrastructure we could identify. They seemed to run from nowhere to nowhere, lying on the bottom like they'd been dropped there. As autumn approached, the underwater investigation reached an impasse. Limited resources, challenging conditions, and the approaching hurricane season forced authorities to suspend diving operations. The scarred creek bottom and mysterious sonar contacts remained largely unexplored, holding whatever secrets lay beneath the dark waters of the Ace Basin. What investigators had discovered was troubling enough. Evidence of long-term environmental disruption, historical patterns of similar incidents, and underwater anomalies that defied easy explanation. But what they hadn't discovered was perhaps more significant. The source of the disturbances, the purpose of the mysterious infrastructure, and whether any of it had played a role in Jerome Washington's disappearance. The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Something was happening beneath the surface of the Ace Basin, something that had been going on for decades. Whether that something had claimed Jerome Washington as its latest victim remained an open question as winter settled over the South Carolina lowcountry. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Patricia Williams, a retired shrimper who had worked these waters for 40 years, approached Officer Chen at the Colleton County Courthouse on October 15th with a collection of tide tables, fishing logs, and newspaper clippings spanning 3 decades. "You're looking at this all wrong," Williams told Chen, spreading the documents across a conference table. "It's not about where these things happen. It's about when." Williams had spent weeks analyzing incident reports, cross-referencing them with astronomical tide data. What emerged was a pattern that official investigators had missed. Every disappearance, every equipment failure, every reported anomaly occurred during specific tidal conditions, the highest spring tides of the lunar cycle, when gravitational forces aligned to create maximum water movement. Jerome went missing on September 23rd, Williams explained, pointing to her calculations. New moon, spring tide, maximum current velocity. Same with the crab boat in '67, same with the 3 other incidents I found in the newspaper archives. Named Officer Chen immediately requested Jerome's GPS tracking data from his vessel's navigation system. The electronic records, preserved on a waterproof hard drive recovered from his wheelhouse, revealed the precise timeline of his final night. At 11:47 p.m., Jerome's boat had been moving steadily through the main channel. At 11:52 p.m., the vessel came to a complete stop at coordinates that placed it directly over the deepest section of scarred creek bottom. For the next 18 minutes, GPS showed the boat remaining stationary despite the strong tidal current. At 12:10 a.m., the vessel began drifting with the tide, its engine apparently shut down. The automatic distress beacon activated at 12:45 a.m., 35 minutes after Jerome's boat first stopped moving. Experienced captains don't anchor in the main channel during peak tide, Williams observed. Jerome knew better. Something made him stop there, or something stopped him. No. The GPS data revealed another crucial detail. Jerome's final position corresponded exactly with underwater cable infrastructure, submerged power lines that supplied electricity to barrier island communities. County utility records showed these cables had experienced recurring problems, shorts, breaks, and unexplained power fluctuations that maintenance crews attributed to saltwater corrosion and storm damage. Electrician Ray Tompkins, who had serviced the underwater cables for 15 years, provided additional context during his interview with investigators. "Those cables have given us trouble since day one," Tompkins explained. "Every few months, we get calls about power outages on the islands. When we check the underwater sections, we find damage that doesn't match normal wear patterns. Cuts, abrasions, sections that look like they've been twisted or pulled." Most significantly, Tompkins' maintenance logs showed that cable damage incidents clustered around the same lunar phases identified in Patricia Williams' research. Spring tides, maximum current flow, highest electrical demand from island communities, operating air conditioning, and water pumps. The investigation took on new urgency when Chen discovered that official navigation charts for the area hadn't been updated in over a decade. Local fishermen like Jerome, relied on traditional knowledge and GPS coordinates that reflected current conditions, while official charts showed clear channels where utility companies had installed underwater infrastructure. There's a disconnect between what's on paper and what's actually down there, Chen documented in her report. Fishermen are navigating by experience and technology, while our emergency response protocols are based on outdated charts. A consultation with electrical engineers from South Carolina Electric and Gas raised additional concerns. The underwater cable system operated at high voltage, enough to create electromagnetic fields that could interfere with boat electronics. During peak tidal conditions, when salt water moved rapidly across the cables, the potential for electrical discharge increased dramatically. If those cables were compromised, explained utility engineer Dr. Mark Stevens, if seawater infiltrated the insulation at multiple points, you could get arcing, electromagnetic pulses, even water electrolysis. The effects would be localized, but potentially dangerous to anyone operating electronic equipment in the immediate vicinity. Whoa. Jerome's boat carried standard marine electronics, GPEs, fish finder, radio bilge pumps, all systems that could malfunction or fail completely when exposed to electromagnetic interference. If such a failure occurred during peak tide conditions in the main shipping channel, an experienced captain might attempt emergency repairs while fighting strong currents. But this theory, while plausible, still didn't explain Jerome's disappearance. Equipment failure might account for his boat's position and the timing of events, but it didn't explain how an experienced waterman had vanished from his own vessel without leaving any trace of struggle or distress. The timing pattern identified by Patricia Williams added another layer to the mystery. If the disappearances were connected to specific tidal conditions and underwater electrical infrastructure, it suggested a recurring hazard that authorities had failed to identify or address. The question remained, was this hazard environmental, mechanical, or something else entirely? We're dealing with a perfect storm of factors, Chen noted in her updated report. Peak tides, electrical infrastructure, outdated navigation charts, and fishermen working alone during optimal conditions. Any one of these factors might be manageable, but when they all align during specific lunar phases, the risk appears to increase dramatically. That's why. As winter approached and tidal ranges decreased, the immediate danger seemed to diminish. But the pattern identified by Williams suggested that the hazard would return with the next series of spring tides, potentially claiming another victim unless the underlying cause could be identified and addressed. On November 3rd, investigators made their final examination of Jerome Washington's recovered vessel. What they found provided the last pieces of a puzzle that remained frustratingly incomplete. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the wheelhouse, Officer Chen discovered Jerome's personal logbook, a weathered composition notebook where he recorded daily observations about weather, tides, and fishing conditions. The entries painted a picture of a man growing increasingly concerned about changes in familiar waters. July 15th. Nets came up torn again. Third time this month. Something down there that wasn't there before. July 28th. Radio acting up near the deep channel. Static and interference like I've never heard. Sounds almost like voices. August 5th. Tides running wrong. Should be slack water but currents still pulling strong to the southeast. Papa never mentioned anything like this. September 12th. Found Miss Sarah at the dock tonight. She says the water spirits are restless, that the old ways aren't holding. Maybe she's right. These waters don't feel the same. The final entry, dated September 23rd, the night Jerome disappeared, consisted of just 4 words. Something's calling me down. Investigators also discovered that Jerome's marine radio had been damaged. Its antenna housing cracked and its circuits corroded by what appeared to be saltwater intrusion. Electronics technician Robert Hayes, who examined the equipment, found evidence of electrical surge damage consistent with exposure to high-voltage discharge. This radio took a hit from something powerful, Hayes concluded. The damage pattern suggests the antenna was energized beyond normal operating parameters. If this happened while Jerome was transmitting, the feedback could have been severe enough to knock him unconscious, or worse. But the most unsettling discovery came from the boat's fish finder, a sonar unit that recorded depth readings and underwater objects. The device's memory contained the last images Jerome had seen before his disappearance. Sonar returns showing large geometric shapes moving along the creek bottom during the peak tide hours. The shapes appeared too regular to be natural debris, too large to be marine life, and too organized to be random objects. Marine electronics expert Dr. Jennifer Cole analyzed the sonar data and found patterns that defied explanation. The returns show objects approximately 40 to 60 feet in length, moving in formation at speeds inconsistent with current flow, Cole reported. The reflectivity signatures suggest metallic composition, but the movement patterns don't match any known marine phenomena. As autumn deepened, the investigation officially transitioned to inactive status. Limited resources, jurisdictional complications, and the approaching winter weather made continued active searching impractical. Officer Chen filed her final report on November 30th, documenting extensive evidence while acknowledging that key questions remained unanswered. The Gullah community, meanwhile, adapted to the changed circumstances with practical wisdom. Fishermen continued working the waters they had harvested for generations, but they avoided the deep channel during spring tide conditions. Traditional fishing practices, passed down through oral tradition, suddenly carried new relevance as modern technology proved unreliable in certain areas. The old people knew things were just figuring out, observed Marcus Thompson, the dive team leader who had explored the scarred creek bottom. They had rules about when to fish, where to go, what waters to respect. Maybe they weren't just superstitions. Miss Sarah, the Gullah elder who had warned about disturbed waters, continued her traditional role as community advisor. When asked by investigators about the ongoing mysteries, she offered a perspective that bridged ancient wisdom and contemporary concerns. The water's been here longer than any of us. It remembers things we've forgotten. Some places, sometimes, you don't go looking for what's down there. You respect the deep water and stay in the shallows. 2 years later, Jerome Washington remains officially listed as missing. His family maintains his dock slip, keeping it ready for his return while knowing that hope grows thinner with each tide cycle. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources continues monitoring the underwater cable infrastructure, reporting occasional equipment malfunctions, but no additional disappearances. Recent developments have added new dimensions to the mystery. Utility companies have upgraded the underwater electrical systems, installing better insulation and monitoring equipment. The ecological damage identified by Dr. Hendricks has begun to heal, with oyster beds showing signs of recovery and fish populations gradually returning to traditional feeding areas. Yet questions persist. The sonar anomalies remain unexplained. The historical pattern of incidents continues to puzzle researchers. The electromagnetic effects documented in the area have no definitive source. And perhaps most troubling, Jerome's final logbook entry. "Something's calling me down," suggests an awareness of danger that he chose to confront rather than avoid. Some theories have emerged from the investigation. The electrical infrastructure theory suggests that damaged underwater cables created hazardous conditions during peak tides, potentially causing equipment failures that led to accidents. The environmental theory points to long-term contamination or ecosystem disruption that affected both marine life and human activities. The cultural theory respects traditional Gullah knowledge about dangerous water conditions that modern science has yet to understand. But no single theory adequately explains all the evidence. The damaged nets, the scarred creek bottom, the mysterious sonar contacts, the electromagnetic interference, and the historical pattern of disappearances form a complex puzzle that resists simple solutions. Today, the Ace Basin continues its eternal rhythm of tide and season. Shrimp boats work the channels where Jerome Washington once prospered, their captains carrying forward traditions that stretch back centuries while navigating waters that harbor secrets the modern world struggles to understand. In the Gullah community, the old stories blend with new experiences, creating a practical wisdom that respects both scientific investigation and traditional knowledge. Some mysteries, perhaps, are meant to remain unsolved, not because the truth is unknowable, but because some truths require a different kind of understanding than conventional investigation can provide. In the deep waters of the South Carolina lowcountry, where tides have run for millennia and will run for millennia more, Jerome Washington's disappearance remains a reminder that even familiar waters can hold unfamiliar depths. The question that haunts investigators isn't just what happened to Jerome Washington, but whether the forces that claimed him are still active beneath the surface, waiting for the next spring tide to bring another unsuspecting mariner into their reach.